The bridge of the exploration vessel Horizon was quiet that morning. Captain Jake Morrison sat in his command chair, reading through reports on his datapad. His ship had been exploring the outer regions of space for 3 months now. The work was important, but boring. They mapped new planets, took readings, and sent information back to Earth. Nothing exciting ever happened out here in the empty darkness between stars. Jake took a sip of his coffee and looked around the bridge. His crew worked at their stations with calm efficiency. Lieutenant Amy Peterson sat at communications, monitoring the usual background noise of space. Commander Greg Hayes stood near the navigation console, checking their course for the next system. Everything was normal and peaceful, just another quiet day in deep space. Then Amy suddenly sat up straight in her chair. Her fingers moved quickly across her console, and her face showed concern. Jake noticed the change immediately and set down his coffee cup. Amy turned to face him with worried eyes. She worked her controls for another minute, trying to clean up whatever signal she was receiving. The bridge fell silent as everyone noticed her concern. Finally, the speakers crackled to life with a desperate voice speaking in an alien language. The ship's computer worked hard to translate the words into English. The voice belonged to someone called Elder Coordinator Vexith of the Quellan colony on a planet called Meridian 7. The message was terrifying in its simplicity. Their colony was dying. The machines that made their air breathable had stopped working. Poison gases from deep underground were flooding into their homes. They had maybe 4 days before everyone would die from breathing the bad air. Their ships had been destroyed in the disaster. They could not escape on their own. 12,000 people lived in the colony, including 3,000 children. They were begging for anyone who could hear them to please come and help. The bridge stayed completely silent for a long moment after the message ended. Jake looked at his first officer, Greg Hayes, who had moved to stand next to the captain's chair. Both men understood what they had just heard. The Quellans were a peaceful species that humans had met a few years ago. They were fragile beings who needed special air to breathe and could only live in low gravity. They were kind and gentle, more interested in art and learning than war or politics. Jake spoke first, his voice steady and calm. He asked Amy how far away the colony was from their current position. Amy checked her calculations quickly. The planet was 6 days away if they traveled at their normal cruise speed. But if they pushed their engines as hard as possible, running them at emergency speeds that were dangerous for the ship, they could reach the colony in 4 days. Greg leaned closer to Jake and spoke quietly. He reminded the captain that the Horizon was an exploration ship, not a rescue vessel. They did not have the equipment or supplies needed to save 12,000 refugees. Their own crew numbered only 200 people. How could they possibly help so many aliens with such different needs? Jake stood up from his chair. His jaw was set with determination, and his eyes showed the kind of resolve that made him a good captain. He gave his orders quickly and clearly. Amy would send a response to the Quellans, letting them know that help was on the way. She would also broadcast an emergency message to any other ships in the region and send all the information back to Earth Command. Greg and the chief engineer, Danny Wright, would figure out how they were going to actually accomplish this impossible rescue mission. Jake made it clear that they were not going to leave 12,000 people to die, no matter how difficult the task ahead might be. The crew immediately sprang into action. The comfortable routine of the past 3 months was shattered. Everyone moved with purpose and urgency. Amy sent the response message to the Quellans, then began broadcasting the emergency alert to nearby vessels. Greg headed to engineering to meet with Danny. Throughout the ship, word spread quickly about what was happening. An alien colony was dying, and the Horizon was going to try to save them. In the engine room, Danny Wright stood among the glowing consoles and humming machinery that powered the ship. He was a big man with strong hands that were always stained with oil and grease. His mind was brilliant when it came to making machines work better. When Greg arrived and explained what the captain wanted to do, Danny's eyes went wide with shock. Greg laid out the problem in simple terms. They needed to convert the cargo bays into living spaces for 12,000 Quellan refugees. They had 4 days to reach the planet. Then they needed to keep all those aliens alive for 6 more days until they could reach the nearest Federation station that could properly help the refugees. Danny let out a long, low whistle of disbelief. He knew that Quellens needed special conditions to survive. They required low gravity because their bodies were adapted to weaker gravitational fields. Their atmosphere was completely different from what humans breathed. They needed air that was mostly nitrogen with small amounts of methane gas mixed in. That combination would make humans sick, but Quellens could not breathe properly without it. Greg asked the most important question. Could Danny actually do this? Could he modify the ship enough to keep 12,000 aliens alive? Danny grinned despite the enormous challenge. He loved solving impossible problems. He told Greg that yes, he could make it work, but he would need help. He wanted Lisa Grant from the life support department and someone from medical who understood Quellen biology and health needs. Within an hour, the cargo bays became busy with activity. Lisa Grant arrived and began working with Danny to reconfigure the atmospheric processors. Lisa was a small woman with sharp features and an even sharper mind. She could diagnose problems with life support systems just by listening to the sounds they made. Together, she and Danny started the complex work of making the cargo bays able to support Quellen life. Lisa explained the challenges to Greg as she worked. They could not perfectly replicate the exact atmosphere that Quellens needed, but they could get close enough. The bigger problem was gravity. Quellens evolved on a world where gravity was only 60% as strong as Earth's gravity. If they spent too much time in normal Earth-like gravity, it would hurt them badly. The children would be especially at risk. Dr. Carl Jensen needed space for medical treatment and isolation rooms in case any diseases could spread between the two species. Greg promised him that he would have whatever space he needed. Captain Morrison had given full authority to make any changes necessary to save the Quellen refugees. The crew worked through the entire night without stopping. They were transforming their exploration ship into a refugee transport vessel. Word spread through every corridor and every deck about what they were trying to accomplish. Everyone learned about the Quellens and their peaceful culture. The colony on Meridian 7 had been built as a place for Quellen artists and philosophers to create and think, far away from the busy political centers of the galaxy. Now that beautiful colony was dying, and the Horizon was racing to save it. Lieutenant Kevin Barnes was the ship's security chief. He found Commander Greg Hayes in a corridor during a brief rest break. Kevin was concerned about the practical problems of having so many refugees on board. His security team consisted of only 30 people. If they brought 12,000 Quellens onto the ship, that meant one security officer for every 400 aliens. Even though the Quellens were peaceful, managing such a large crowd would be nearly impossible. Greg understood the problem and asked Kevin what he recommended. Kevin's advice was simple but smart. They needed to organize the refugees and get the Quellen community leaders involved in maintaining order. The Quellens were peaceful and intelligent. If the humans explained the situation clearly and gave the aliens responsibilities to help, they would cooperate. Kevin believed that working with the Quellens rather than trying to control them would be the best approach. Greg agreed with the suggestion and made notes to discuss it with Captain Morrison. Meanwhile, back in engineering, Danny and his team had been working for 16 hours straight without rest. The cargo bays were changing rapidly. Temporary living quarters were being built from storage containers. The containers were stacked efficiently to save space while keeping the ceilings low, which Quellens preferred. The atmospheric processors hummed as they were recalibrated, mixing gases in the strange combinations that Quellens needed to breathe. Lisa Grant found Danny taking a brief moment to review their progress. She asked him jokingly if he wanted coffee or sleep. Danny replied with a tired grin that he wanted both at the same time if possible. But he was satisfied with their progress. In another day, they would have something that could actually keep the refugees alive and reasonably comfortable. The Horizon continued pushing through space at maximum speed. The engines strained and complained, running hotter and harder than they were designed for. On the bridge, Captain Jake Morrison stood watch over everything. His eyes kept returning to the countdown timer on the main display. 4 days to reach Meridian 7. 4 days to finish their preparations. Then the real challenge would begin. As the second day of travel began, more crew members volunteered to help with the preparations. The ship's botanist, Helen Martinez, suggested they could accelerate the growth cycles in the hydroponics bay to produce more food. The Quellans would need to eat, and the ship's supplies were calculated for a crew of 200, not for thousands of refugees. Helen worked with the Quellan nutritional data that Dr. Jensen had provided, trying to figure out which Earth plants might be digestible for the aliens. In the cargo bays, the transformation continued at an incredible pace. Lighting was adjusted to the dimmer levels that Quellans preferred. Temperature controls were modified because the aliens liked their environment slightly cooler than humans did. Even small details mattered. The Quellans had different social customs and privacy needs. The living spaces had to be arranged in ways that would make sense to the refugees and help them feel safe rather than trapped. Amy Peterson took a break from her communications duties to visit the cargo bays and see the work in progress. She walked through the transformed spaces with wonder. Just 2 days ago, these had been simple storage areas full of equipment and supplies. Now they were becoming temporary homes for thousands of refugees. The dedication and hard work of the crew amazed her. Danny found Amy standing in the largest cargo bay, looking at the rows of small living units they had constructed. He walked over to her, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. He explained how the atmospheric system worked, pointing to the processors mounted on the walls. The air in this bay would be completely different from the air in the rest of the ship. Humans could not breathe it safely, so there were special airlocks and transition zones where the atmosphere gradually changed between the two types. Amy asked Danny if he really thought this would work. Would 12,000 Quellans be able to survive in these modified cargo bays for 6 days? Danny was honest with her. He said it would not be comfortable, and it would be crowded. The refugees would be scared and grieving for their lost home. But yes, they would survive. The ship could keep them alive long enough to reach the Federation station where proper help waited. The third day brought new challenges. Greg Hayes called a meeting of all department heads to coordinate their efforts. Medical, engineering, security, communications, and supply officers all gathered in the briefing room. Each person reported on their preparations and any problems they had encountered. Dr. Carl Jensen explained that his medical bay could handle maybe 50 patients at most. But based on the distress call, they should expect hundreds of refugees with serious injuries and toxic gas exposure. He had converted 2 other spaces into auxiliary medical facilities, but he was still worried about being overwhelmed. His staff consisted of only 12 medical personnel. They would need to train other crew members in basic first aid for Quellans. Lisa Grant reported that the atmospheric systems were working perfectly in testing. However, she warned that running multiple different atmospheres on one ship would put enormous strain on the environmental processors. They would need to monitor everything constantly during the journey back to the Federation station. Any failure could be deadly for the refugees. Kevin Barnes had created an organizational plan for managing the refugees. He wanted to identify Quellan community leaders as soon as possible and work with them to maintain order. He also suggested setting up clear communication channels so that refugees could report problems or ask for help without causing panic. Helen Martinez delivered bad news about food supplies. Even with the accelerated growing in hydroponics, they would not have enough food for everyone. She recommended Stricon the 4th day. The Horizon dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Meridian 7 star system. The crew finally got their first look at the dying colony world. From orbit, the planet appeared beautiful. It was a pale blue world with white clouds swirling across its surface and 3 small moons circling nearby. The sight was peaceful and lovely, but the sensor readings told a completely different story about what was happening below. Amy Peterson studied her console with growing concern. She reported that massive atmospheric contamination was spreading across the colony's site. Sulfur dioxide levels were climbing rapidly and were already dangerously high. The Quellans had not been exaggerating in their distress call. The planet was truly becoming a deadly gas chamber, and time was running out faster than anyone had predicted. Captain Jake Morrison stared at the main view screen, looking down at the planet. He could see the Quellan colony on the surface through the magnification. The settlement consisted of elegant dome structures that seemed to grow organically from the landscape. The architecture was beautiful and artistic, designed to blend with nature rather than dominate it. That was typical of Quellan building style. But now, those graceful domes were surrounded by an ugly yellowish haze of toxic gases. Jake ordered Amy to open communications with the colony. The view screen flickered and changed to show an alien face. Elder Coordinator Vexith appeared on the screen. He was a Quellan in the later years of his life. His translucent skin showed faint blue patterns that indicated high levels of stress and fear. His large, dark eyes held a mixture of desperate hope and barely controlled panic. Vexith's voice trembled as he spoke. He could not believe that the human ship had actually come. The colonists had begun to lose hope as their situation grew worse. Things had deteriorated even faster than their initial predictions. Some of the outer domes had already been breached by the toxic gases. 200 Quellans had died in those breaches, suffocated by the poisonous air that flooded into their homes. Jake felt the weight of those deaths settle on his shoulders. 200 people were already gone, and they were still preparing to begin the evacuation. He introduced himself as Captain Jake Morrison and explained that the Horizon was there to evacuate the entire colony. However, he needed the Quellans to start organizing their people for evacuation. The ship would send down shuttles as soon as possible, but everything would work better if the colony was prepared and organized on their end. Vexith immediately asked what the humans needed from the Quellans. Jake gave clear instructions. The injured and the children should be prioritized for the first shuttles. The Horizon had medical facilities prepared and special accommodations for young ones. Quellan engineers would need to come aboard to help the humans understand any specific needs. Community leaders should prepare to help maintain order during what would be a chaotic and frightening evacuation process. Vexith nodded, with visible relief flooding across his alien features. He explained that the colony did have evacuation protocols, though they had never believed they would actually need to use them. The survival committee would immediately coordinate with the human crew. Then Vexith said something that touched Jake deeply. The Elder could not express how grateful the Quellans were. The humans had traveled so far to save strangers, people they had never met and owed nothing to. Jake smiled, though his expression was grim with determination. He told Vexith that this was simply what neighbors did for each other. The first shuttle would land on the surface within an hour. Then he ended the communication and turned to his crew. It was time to begin the rescue operation. The next several hours became a carefully controlled chaos of constant activity. The Horizon's 4 shuttles began making repeated trips between the ship and the planet's surface. Each shuttle could carry about 60 Quellans safely. The crew members piloting the shuttles pushed hard, making the trips as quickly as possible while still being safe. Human crew members went down to the surface to assist with organizing the evacuation, and each shuttle returned carrying the first groups of refugees. The most seriously injured Quellans came up first, carried on stretchers into the medical bay. Dr. Carl Jensen and his staff began working immediately to save lives. The medical team had prepared as well as they could, but nothing could fully prepare someone for the reality of treating aliens who had been exposed to toxic gases. The Quellans who had been in the breached domes suffered from terrible damage to their delicate lung tissues. The sulfur dioxide had scarred and burned their respiratory systems. Lieutenant Commander Rachel Kim was the ship's chief medical officer and Dr. Jensen's right hand. She gave Captain Morrison a brief update during a pause in the stream of incoming wounded. She explained that they were doing everything possible for the injured refugees. However, some of the Quellans had waited too long or been exposed to too much of the toxic gas. Their lungs were simply too damaged to heal. The medical team could only make those patients comfortable and ease their pain as they died. Jake's expression was hard and sad as he listened. He told Rachel to do whatever she could. Every single life they managed to save mattered, and the crew should not give up on anyone until there was absolutely no hope left. Down on the planet's surface, Lieutenant Amy Peterson had volunteered to coordinate the ground operations. She stood in the central plaza of the Quellan colony, surrounded by thousands of anxious aliens. The Quellans were shorter than humans, with elongated limbs that gave them a graceful, almost floating way of moving. Even in their fear and panic, they moved with an inherent elegance that was beautiful to watch. Amy spoke through a translator device that converted her English words into the Quellan language. She asked everyone to please remain calm. There were enough shuttles to evacuate every single person, but they needed to proceed in an organized manner. Families with young children should move to areas marked with green lights. Anyone who needed medical help should go to the red-marked areas. Everyone else should form orderly lines at the blue markers. The Quellans responded well to clear instructions. Despite their fear, they began organizing themselves into groups. Parents gathered their children and moved toward the green zones. The injured were helped to the red areas where human medical personnel waited with portable equipment. The general population formed lines and waited their turns with remarkable patience. Danny Wright stood near one of the massive atmospheric processors that had failed. He examined the damaged machinery with a team of Quellan engineers. The processors were sophisticated pieces of technology designed to pull gases from deep underground and convert them into breathable atmosphere for the dome habitats. Something had gone catastrophically wrong in the geological layers beneath the colony. A massive volcanic event had released enormous quantities of toxic gases that overwhelmed all the safety systems. Danny spoke gently to the lead Quellan engineer, a young female named Zithia. He told her that the disaster was not the fault of her or her team. There was no way they could have predicted a volcanic event of such massive scale. The forces involved were beyond anything the colony's sensors were designed to detect. Zithia looked miserable despite Danny's kind words. She believed that they should have had better safeguards in place. Their monitoring systems should have detected pressure. Bill Commander Greg Hayes gave Captain Morrison regular updates on the evacuation progress. After many hours of constant shuttle trips, they had successfully evacuated 9,000 Quellans. However, the situation on the planet's surface was getting worse with every passing hour. The toxic gases were spreading faster than the initial projections had predicted. Some of the central domes, which should have been safe for at least another day, were already beginning to show dangerous stress fractures in their structures. Jake studied the sensor data carefully. His jaw was clenched tight as he processed the information. He asked Greg how much longer it would take to evacuate everyone at their current pace. Greg checked his calculations and delivered bad news. At the current rate, they needed at least another 8 hours to get the remaining 3,000 refugees off the planet. But looking at the deteriorating conditions on the surface, Greg did not believe they had 8 hours left before more domes collapsed. Jake made a command decision without hesitation. He ordered every available environmental suit to be deployed to the surface. He called for volunteers from the crew to go down and assist with speeding up the evacuation. They were going to make this happen faster, even if it meant crew members had to physically carry refugees to the waiting shuttles. Within 1 hour, 30 additional human crew members had joined the surface operation. They spread out through the failing domes, moving quickly but carefully. They helped elderly Quellans who struggled to move through the higher gravity. They carried children who were too young or too weak to walk quickly. Most importantly, they provided calm reassurance to families who were terrified of leaving the only home they had ever known. Lieutenant Kevin Barnes found himself carrying a small Quellan child who had become separated from her family in the chaos of evacuation. The little girl was crying with fear and confusion, her thin arms wrapped tightly around Kevin's neck as she trembled. Kevin spoke softly to her in English, even though he knew she could not understand his words. But something in his gentle tone seemed to provide comfort. The child stopped crying and simply held on as Kevin made his way through the crowded dome. Kevin scanned the faces of passing Quellans, looking for anyone who might be the child's parents. Finally, he spotted a frantic couple who were clearly searching desperately for someone. When they saw Kevin carrying their daughter, they rushed toward him. The reunion was emotional and tearful. The Quellan father gripped Kevin's hand in their species' gesture of deep gratitude and respect. Kevin felt a lump form in his throat. This moment, this reunited family, was exactly why they were here. This was why the human race had pushed out into the stars, to be present when someone needed help. The evacuation continued with renewed urgency. The human crew members worked tirelessly alongside the Quellans. Despite the language barriers and the differences in their biology, the two species worked together smoothly. The Quellans were impressed and moved by how hard the humans pushed themselves. These beings from the legendary death world called Earth were risking their own safety to save strangers. Hour 26 of the evacuation operation arrived with both triumph and disaster. The cargo bays of the Horizon now held more than 11,000 Quellan refugees. The ship was packed far beyond anything the designers had ever imagined. New refugees continued arriving with every shuttle trip, and the ship's systems groaned under the impossible load. In the engine room, Danny Wright monitored stress levels on every system with growing concern. He contacted the bridge with a warning. The environmental systems were in the red zone, running far beyond their safe operating parameters. The life support processors were working constantly to maintain the different atmospheres needed by humans and Quellans. Additionally, the ship's structural integrity was beginning to suffer. They had 11,000 beings living in spaces that were designed to hold cargo, not to support life. The weight distribution was wrong, and the hull was showing stress fractures in several locations. Captain Morrison listened to Danny's report while watching another shuttle dock with more refugees. He asked the critical question: how many more refugees could the ship safely hold? Danny's answer was complicated. Theoretically, if they packed people in very tightly with no concern for comfort, they might be able to fit another 1,500 individuals. Practically, considering the safety of everyone already aboard and the integrity of the ship, Danny strongly recommended they stop taking refugees immediately before something critical failed. Jake's response was immediate and firm. Stopping was not an option. There were still 1,000 people down on that dying planet, and the colony was falling apart around them. They were not going to leave anyone behind, regardless of the risk to the ship. They would find a way to make it work. On the planet's surface, the situation reached its breaking point. The largest of the central domes, which housed several hundred Quellans who were waiting for evacuation, suddenly developed a critical structural failure. Amy Peterson coordinated the final groups, her voice now hoarse and raw from hours of shouting instructions. She urged everyone to move immediately to the shuttles and to leave all their belongings behind. There was no time for anything except getting people to safety. Elder Coordinator Vexith stood beside Amy throughout the crisis. The old Quellan leader had absolutely refused to evacuate until every other member of his colony was safe. Amy had argued with him about it multiple times during the long evacuation, but she had eventually stopped trying to convince him. She understood the responsibility and duty he felt toward his people. A deep rumbling sound echoed through the dome structure. Amy looked up just in time to see the transparent material of the dome beginning to fracture. Long cracks spread across the surface like lightning bolts. She screamed for everyone to move immediately to the shuttles. The last groups of Quellans ran as fast as they could manage in the heavy gravity, heading for the open shuttle ramps. Then the dome collapsed completely. The transparent composite material shattered into thousands of pieces that rained down on everyone below. The toxic yellow atmosphere of the dying planet rushed in through the massive breach. Quellans screamed and scrambled for safety. Amy felt a strong hand grab her arm and pull her forcefully toward the nearest shuttle. Lieutenant Kevin Barnes dragged Amy while simultaneously pushing Elder Vexith ahead of both of them. The three of them stumbled up the shuttle ramp together just as the pilot launched the craft. The pilot did not even wait for the ramp to fully close before firing the engines and shooting upward through the poisonous atmosphere toward the safety of the horizon. Amy gasped for breath, her lungs burning painfully. Despite wearing an environmental suit, she had inhaled some of the sulfur dioxide during those final chaotic seconds. Her throat felt like it was on fire. Kevin was in even worse condition. He coughed violently, his whole body shaking as the shuttle's automatic medical systems administered emergency treatment to both humans. Through her pain, Amy managed to ask the most important question. Was everyone accounted for? Had they gotten all the refugees off the planet? The pilot checked his manifest quickly, comparing numbers against the original population count from the colony records. His voice showed relief and exhaustion as he confirmed that the last shuttle was away. All 12,000 Quellans were now accounted for. Despite the final die on the horizon, Dr. Carl Jensen and his medical team faced an overwhelming crisis. The last groups of refugees who had been evacuated during the dome collapse suffered from significant toxic gas exposure. Dozens of Quellans were in critical condition with severe respiratory damage. The medical bay was completely full. There was literally no more space, and injured refugees were lying on stretchers in the corridors because there was nowhere else to put them. Carl contacted Commander Greg Hayes with desperation clear in his voice. He needed more space immediately, more medical equipment, and more help. His staff had been working for over 30 hours without rest, and they were completely exhausted. Despite their best efforts, patients were dying in the hallways because the medical facilities simply could not handle this many critical cases at once. Greg made a quick decision that would later be mentioned in official reports as an example of human creativity under extreme pressure. He asked Danny Wright if they could convert one of the ship's observation lounges into an emergency medical facility. Danny's response came back almost immediately. He was already working on it. Lisa Grant was setting up atmospheric separation fields so they could treat Quellens in their proper native air mixture while keeping the space safe for human medical workers. Danny promised to have it ready in 1 hour. Greg gave him an even tighter deadline. He told Danny that he had 30 minutes, not an hour. Too many refugees were dying while they waited. The crew performed what could only be described as a miracle of improvisation and desperate innovation. The observation lounge had been a beautiful space designed for crew recreation. It featured panoramic windows that showed stunning views of the stars. Within 40 minutes, that peaceful room had been transformed into a functioning emergency medical ward. Equipment was relocated from storage, portable life support systems were installed and activated, and Dr. Jensen suddenly had the additional treatment space he desperately needed. However, the strain on the ship continued to increase. The Horizon had never been designed to carry this many living beings. Every single system was operating far beyond its safe limits. The recycling plants that provided clean air and water were working around the clock without any rest periods. The nuclear reactors that powered the ship were pushing out more energy than the engineers recommended. Most worrying, the structural framework of the ship was groaning and creaking under the uneven weight distribution of thousands of refugees packed into cargo spaces. Danny reported new problems to the captain. He was getting automated stress warnings from multiple sections of the hull. The ship was simply too heavy now, and the mass was not distributed properly throughout the structure. If they attempted to jump into hyperspace in this condition, the ship might literally tear itself apart from the stress. The refugees would die, the crew would die, and the Horizon would be destroyed. Jake asked what Danny needed to fix the problem. Danny's answer involved two things. First, he needed time to carefully redistribute the refugees more evenly throughout the ship. Second, they needed to reduce the ship's total mass somehow. If they could jettison non-essential equipment and cargo, they might be able to lighten the load enough to safely make the hyperspace jump. Jake gave the authorization immediately. Danny could sacrifice whatever he needed to save the ship and its passengers. The priority was getting to the Federation station safely. Everything else was secondary. The next 12 hours tested everyone's endurance to its absolute limits. The Quellen refugees had to be moved in small groups, carefully relocated from the dangerously overloaded cargo bays to other sections throughout the ship. It was extremely uncomfortable and crowded wherever they went, but the redistribution balanced the mass across the ship's structure. Meanwhile, anything that was not essential for survival was jettisoned into space. Storage containers full of spare parts that could be replaced later were pushed out the airlocks. Scientific equipment that had cost millions was abandoned. Even some of the modular furniture from crew quarters was sacrificed to reduce weight. Through everything, the Quellen refugees showed remarkable patience and cooperation. They understood that the humans were pushing themselves and their ship to absolute breaking points to save them. Elder Coordinator Vexith moved among his people constantly, offering comfort and encouragement. He worked to keep spirits up even as he dealt with his own overwhelming grief over losing the colony that had been his home and responsibility. Vexith spoke to small gatherings of refugees in the cargo bays. He reminded them that while Meridian 7 was lost, the Quellen people survived. Their culture, their children, and their future remained intact. Thanks to the brave humans from the death world called Earth who had crossed the stars to help complete strangers, the Quellens would have the chance to rebuild and create something new. With the ship finally rebalanced and lightened, Captain Morrison gave the order to engage the hyperspace drive. The engines whined in protest, the sound rising to a painful pitch that echoed through the hull. Every crew member held their breath, hoping the ship would hold together. Then the stars stretched into familiar lines of light as the Horizon leaped across vast distances of space. The ship had survived the jump. Now they faced 6 days of keeping 12,000 refugees alive during the journey to the Federation station. The first major crisis came on day 2 of the journey. A group of young Quellan children began showing alarming symptoms of respiratory distress. Dr. Jensen immediately quarantined them, deeply worried that some kind of infectious disease might spread through the dangerously crowded conditions on the ship. If an illness started spreading among 12,000 beings living in close quarters, it could quickly become a catastrophic epidemic. Rachel Kim ran extensive medical tests on the sick children. After several tense hours, she announced her findings. It was not an infection or disease. The children were suffering from stress-induced asthma, made much worse by the trauma they had experienced and the imperfect atmospheric conditions. Their young bodies were trying hard to adjust to the humans' approximation of Quellan air, but the youngest and most fragile individuals were having the most difficulty breathing properly. The solution required yet another round of careful atmospheric adjustments by Lisa Grant. She spent hours fine-tuning the gas mixtures, adjusting the atmospheric processors to even closer tolerances for the sections where children were housed. It was extremely delicate work that pushed the processors to their absolute operational limits. But the adjustments worked. Within a few hours, the children were breathing easier and their distress symptoms began to improve. Day 3 of the journey brought a completely different kind of problem. Chief Supply Officer Helen Martinez brought concerning news to Commander Greg Hayes. The food supplies were running dangerously low. The Horizon had been stocked with provisions for a crew of 200 people for a 3-month exploration mission. Nobody had planned for feeding 12,000 additional refugees for nearly 2 weeks. The Quellans had brought no supplies with them from the doomed colony because there had been no time during the desperate evacuation. Helen explained the situation clearly. The ship had enough food to keep the human crew fed properly. The Quellans ate different foods than humans anyway, so there was no direct competition for the same supplies. But the ship simply did not carry sufficient quantities of the specific nutrients and mineral supplements that Quellans required for healthy survival. Lieutenant Amy Peterson had recovered enough from her toxic gas exposure to take on a new role. She became the main liaison between the human crew and the Quellan refugees. She spent her days moving through the crowded sections of the ship where the Quellans lived. She learned basic phrases in their language and worked hard to solve the countless small problems that arose when two very different species tried to live together in extremely cramped quarters. Amy reported to Captain Morrison about the cultural challenges they faced. She explained that the differences between humans and Quellans were fascinating but also complicated. Quellans processed social interaction in completely different ways than humans did. What humans saw as helpful closeness and friendly crowding, the Quellans experienced as invasive and uncomfortable. The crew had to adjust how they delivered food and provided medical care to respect Quellan social boundaries and customs. Jake asked how the refugees were holding up emotionally after everything they had been through. Amy took a moment to consider the question carefully before answering. She said the Quellans were grieving deeply. They had lost their homes, all their possessions, and everything familiar in their lives. Many had lost family members and friends in the disaster. The grief and trauma were profound. But at the same time, the refugees were incredibly grateful. Dozens of Quellans approached Amy every day to express their thanks. They kept calling the human crew members the warriors from the Deathworld, which Amy found both touching and amusing. Jake raised an eyebrow at that phrase. He asked what Amy meant by Deathworld. Amy explained with a slight smile that Earth was officially classified as a Class 12 Deathworld in the Federation's planetary database. Most species in the galaxy considered Earth to be an extremely hostile and dangerous planet. It had high gravity that would crush many alien species. The weather was violent and unpredictable. Dangerous predators existed everywhere. Diseases and parasites were common. Even the atmosphere was slightly toxic to many species because of the high oxygen content. The Quellans could not believe that any species from such a terrifying planet would travel across the galaxy to save them. To the refugees, humans were incredibly brave and strong just for surviving on Earth in the first place. The fact that these powerful warriors from a death world had come to rescue fragile, peaceful artists and philosophers seemed almost unbelievable to them. This perspective had never occurred to Jake before. Humans had always thought of Earth as home, a beautiful blue and green world that was precious and worth protecting. But to species that evolved in gentler, safer environments, Earth was essentially a nightmare planet. Its inhabitants must seem like incredible survivors to aliens who came from easier worlds. On day 4 of the journey, the Horizon's main reactor began showing dangerous signs of strain. Danny Wright spent 18 hours straight in the hot, noisy engineering spaces, carefully managing power distribution to keep every critical system functioning. The ship was consuming energy at rates the designers had never imagined possible. The fusion reactor was being pushed far beyond its rated safe capacity. Danny finally contacted the captain with bad news. They needed to reduce power consumption somewhere immediately. If the reactor failed or melted down, they would be stranded dead in space with absolutely no way to maintain life support for 12,000 beings. Everyone would die slowly as the air became unbreathable and the temperature dropped. Jake had to make another difficult decision. He ordered non-essential systems throughout the ship to be shut down. Lighting in many corridors was reduced to minimum emergency levels only. The artificial gravity in some sections was adjusted to lower levels to save power. Entertainment systems that helped crew members relax were shut off. Research equipment stopped running. Even some of the redundant backup sensors were powered down to conserve energy. The Quellans understood the sacrifice being made and adapted without any complaints. They began organizing their own community activities to keep morale up and spirits positive. These activities required no technology or power. In the darkened cargo bays that were lit only by dim emergency strips, thousands of Quellans would gather together to listen to their elders. The old ones told stories of Quellan history and culture, shared traditional songs that had been passed down for generations, and led meditations that helped everyone stay calm. Elder Coordinator Vexith became a frequent visitor to the ship's bridge. He offered his assistance wherever it might be helpful or needed. Over the days of the journey, he and Captain Morrison developed a strong mutual respect. They were two leaders from completely different species and cultures, but both were trying their absolute best to guide their people through an impossible situation. During one of their conversations, Vexith spoke thoughtfully to Jake. He said that humans were truly remarkable beings. Every species in the Galactic Federation talked about humanity's aggressive nature, their warrior culture, and their origins on a deadly hostile world. But what Vexith saw on the horizon was something very different. He saw compassion, willing sacrifice, and an incredible drive to help others even at great cost. The humans had traveled 6 days at dangerous speeds that risked their ship. They had given up their own comfort, safety, and food. And they asked for absolutely nothing in return. Jake thought carefully about how to respond. He told Vexith that humans were not warriors by choice or preference. Yes, they came from a harsh and dangerous world, and yes, humanity had been forced to fight throughout its history just to survive. But that difficult history had taught humans the incredible value of cooperation and helping those in need. On Earth, your neighbor's survival often meant your own survival. Working together was how humans had thrived. They naturally carried that philosophy with them to the stars. Vexith replied that the galaxy was very fortunate to have humanity among the spacefaring species. If humans from a death world could be so kind and generous, perhaps they would teach other species important lessons about what it truly meant to be civilized. On day 6, as the horizon finally approached the Federation station, emergency alarms suddenly screamed through the ship. A critical failure in one of the cargo bay atmospheric processors threatened to flood an entire section with the wrong gas mixture. If the system failed completely, it would potentially suffocate hundreds of Quellan refugees within minutes. Danny and Lisa raced to the location with their tools and equipment. They had only minutes to fix the problem before the atmosphere became deadly. Working together with perfect coordination born of days of crisis management, they bypassed the failed component. They rerouted the entire atmospheric system through a backup processor that was already handling another section of the ship. Lisa warned Danny as she made the final connections. This solution would dangerously overload the backup processor. It might burn out or fail completely. Danny replied grimly that the backup only needed to hold for a few more hours. They were almost at the station. It would be enough. The emergency fix held successfully. The atmospheric crisis was averted, though it had been terrifyingly close to disaster. Finally, 6 long days after fleeing Meridian 7, the Horizon arrived at Federation Station Kepler 442. The massive orbital facility was specifically designed and equipped to handle large-scale humanitarian crises. It had extensive medical facilities, temporary housing for thousands of refugees, and most importantly, all the resources needed to properly care for 12,000 displaced Quellans. As the damaged, overloaded Horizon slowly docked with the station, Jake stood on the bridge watching the Federation response teams mobilize. Medical personnel rushed to help. Social workers prepared to assist families. Engineers stood ready to help transfer refugees safely. Everyone was rushing to provide help to the survivors. A message came through from the station commander, Admiral Foster Chen. He congratulated Captain Morrison on accomplishing something extraordinary. The Federation Council was already preparing formal commendations for Jake and his entire crew. They had saved 12,000 lives against absolutely impossible odds. Jake felt the enormous weight of the past 10 days finally settle fully onto his tired shoulders. He responded simply to the Admiral. They had only done what anyone should do. They happened to be there when people desperately needed help, so they provided that help. As the Quellan refugees began disembarking from the Horizon, many of them stopped to personally thank the human crew members. There were tears and embraces adapted for the different body structures of the two species. There were promises to always remember the kindness they had been shown. The gratitude was overwhelming and deeply moving. Elder Coordinator Vexith was the very last refugee to leave the ship. He stood before Captain Jake Morrison and formally performed the traditional Quellan gesture of eternal gratitude. It was a complex series of hand movements combined with a deep, respectful bow. The gesture meant that the debt could never be fully repaid, and the gratitude would last forever. Vexith spoke with deep emotion. He promised that the Quellan people would never forget what Jake and his crew had done. The humans from Earth had come from their death world to save the Quellans. They had risked their lives and their ship without hesitation. They had asked for nothing in return. In Quellan histories that would be written and passed down through generations, the crew of the Horizon would be remembered as true heroes. The humans had taught the Quellans that the strongest warriors could also possess the kindest souls. Jake gently shook the elder's fragile hand. He told Vexith to take good care of his people and to build something beautiful wherever the Quellans eventually settled. That would be all the thanks the crew needed or wanted. As the Horizon undocked from the station and began the long journey back to Earth for extensive repairs, the exhausted crew gathered in what remained of the observation lounge. They had been pushed beyond every limit, tested in ways they never imagined. But they were proud of what they had accomplished together. Captain Morrison addressed his crew with deep sincerity and respect. He told them they had done truly good work. What they accomplished would be studied and talked about for many years to come. An exploration vessel had been converted into a refugee ship through pure determination and creativity. 12,000 lives had been saved against impossible odds, and a real friendship had been forged between two very different species. Jake said he was proud of every single person who had been part of this mission. The crew responded with heartfelt applause. They were tired beyond words, but the applause was genuine and full of emotion. They had faced something that should have been impossible, and they had succeeded. They had prevailed not through weapons or military force, but through determination, creative problem-solving, and most importantly, compassion for others in desperate need. As the Horizon jumped back into hyperspace, heading toward home, the story of the rescue at Meridian 7 was already spreading rapidly through the Galactic Federation. Humanity, the species from the terrifying death world called Earth, had shown the entire galaxy what true strength really meant. It was not about conquest or domination or violence. Real strength came from the courage to help those in need, regardless of the personal cost or risk. On many different worlds throughout the galaxy, alien species who had previously feared the aggressive humans from Earth began seeing them in a completely new light. Perhaps these Deathworlders could become the very best neighbors the galaxy had ever known. Greg asked about the hydroponics bay where the ship grew fresh plants. Helen reported that she had already pushed the growing systems to accelerated cycles. But even running the hydroponics at maximum capacity, they could not possibly produce enough food for 12,000 mouths. Greg made a difficult decision. They would implement strict rationing. The human crew would have their food rations cut by 30%. Everything that could be spared would be allocated to the refugees. Greg also told Helen to work with Quellan nutritionists to see if they could find substitute foods among the human supplies that might work for Quellan biology. When Greg announced the rationing plan to the crew, not a single person complained or objected. Everyone understood completely what was at stake. In fact, several crew members immediately volunteered to reduce their personal rations even further to ensure the Quellan children would have enough to eat. The spirit of sacrifice and dedication was universal among the humans. Saster, they had successfully evacuated every single survivor from the doomed colony. Amy felt tears streaming down her face. They were tears of relief, pain, and exhausted triumph. Against all odds, despite every challenge and setback, they had actually done it. 12,000 lives had been saved. The Horizon had accomplished something that should have been impossible. But their problems were very far from over. The ship was now dangerously overloaded with refugees. The journey to the nearest Federation station would take 6 more days. 6 days of keeping everyone alive on a ship that was already breaking under the strain. 6 days of managing limited food supplies, overtaxed life support systems, and mounting technical failures. The rescue mission had succeeded, but the real test was just beginning. Ding up in the deep geological layers. There must have been warning signs for weeks or even months before the catastrophic release, but they had missed or ignored all of them. Danny placed a reassuring hand on her thin shoulder, being very careful to be gentle because Quellans were physically fragile compared to humans. He told Zythia that analyzing what went wrong could wait for later. Right now, the only thing that mattered was getting her and all her people to safety. He invited her to come aboard the Horizon where her expertise and knowledge would be valuable. They could study the disaster and figure out what happened after everyone was safe. The evacuation continued through the entire day and into the night. The shuttles made trip after trip without stopping. Each time a shuttle landed, it was quickly loaded with as many Quellans as it could safely carry. Then it launched back toward the Horizon in orbit. Hundreds of refugees became thousands. The cargo bays began filling with frightened families huddling together in the temporary shelters that had been prepared for them. The modified atmosphere seemed to be working correctly. The Quellans could breathe without difficulty, though many of them looked uncomfortable. The gravity was still higher than what they were accustomed to, and it clearly caused them physical strain. The children especially struggled with the heavier weight, but they were alive and safe. Tea rationing for both the human crew and the Quellan refugees. Everyone would be hungry, but nobody would starve during the 6-day journey. Captain Morrison listened to all the reports carefully. When everyone had finished, he thanked them for their incredible work. He acknowledged that what they were attempting was dangerous and difficult. The Horizon was not designed for this mission. They were improvising and adapting, pushing the ship and themselves to the absolute limits. But he also reminded them why they were doing it. 12,000 innocent lives depended on them. Failure was not acceptable. As the meeting ended and everyone returned to their duties, Jake stayed in the briefing room for a moment. Greg remained with him, sensing that the captain wanted to talk. Jake admitted that he was worried, not about his crew or their dedication, but about all the things that could go wrong. What if the ship's systems failed under the strain? What if they could not reach the colony in time? What if some of the refugees died despite their best efforts? Greg placed a hand on his captain's shoulder. He reminded Jake that they could only do their best. The Quellans were facing certain death if the Horizon did not help them. Even if everything went perfectly, some refugees might still die. But every life they saved was a victory. The crew understood the risks and had accepted them willingly. They were proud to be part of this rescue mission. Danny had an idea. The cargo bays rotated to create artificial gravity through centrifugal force. If they adjusted the rotation speed in certain sections, they could reduce the gravity in those areas. It would not be perfect, but it would be much better than full Earth gravity. Greg approved the plan immediately. He asked what else they needed to prepare for the refugees. Dr. Carl Jensen from the medical bay arrived with information about Quellan health and medicine. He explained that they would need to set up emergency treatment areas. The distress message had mentioned toxic gas exposure, which meant many of the refugees would have damaged lungs and possibly chemical burns on their skin.